Combustible dust explosions can be one of the most under-recognized hazards in industrial facilities. Without proper awareness and planning, the risk of an incident can threaten the life safety and operational continuity of any organization. Let's take a moment to discuss combustible dust awareness for this month's safety training. In 2019, a complete dust hazard analysis was performed at Stewart's Draft, and it validated what many of us already know today. We possess material that can be a combustible dust hazard in the workplace if it's not managed correctly. The materials that we use in manufacturing our various products pose a combustible dust hazard at Stewart's Draft. They are cornstarch, dry milk, sugar, cocoa powder, flour, and powdered milk. Salt and baking powder don't fall into the combustible dust hazard arena and therefore aren't combustible material. Other examples of combustible dust that are hazardous but do not exist at Stewart's Draft are coal dusts, lactose, sulfur, plastic dust such as phenolic resins, or metal dust like aluminum, magnesium, or titanium. So why do we care so much about combustible dust? That's a great question. Combustible dusts are materials that have the potential to detonate and explode when several factors converge. These factors don't exist at home or with other ordinary dust, and since we deal in large quantities at Stewart's Draft, there is a much greater potential here. To have fire, there must be three sufficient elements to support it: heat, air, and fuel. This is called the fire triangle. If just one of the three elements is missing, a fire will not start or exist. Combustible dust works on much the same theory and needs 5 sufficient elements in order for detonation and explosion to occur. The combustible dust elements are combustible dust, dispersion, ignition source, confinement, and sufficient oxygen. Remember, just like the fire triangle, a dust explosion can't occur unless all 5 elements are present in sufficient quantities. But when all elements exist, there is a high potential for detonation and explosion. You can see in the photos of the Imperial Sugar Factory combustible dust explosion that occurred in Chatham City, Georgia. This is a photo after the explosion, and it highlights the location of where the raw sugar warehouse was and the incredible power a dust explosion possesses. Here is another example of the Imperial Sugar Factory in Port Wentworth, Georgia. This massive dust explosion killed 14 and injured 38. So, how does something like dust cause this amount of destruction? Let's dive deeper and take a look. Remember, a combustible dust explosion needs 5 elements in sufficient quantities for an explosion to occur: combustible dust, oxygen, dispersion, confinement, and an ignition source. No dust explosion occurs if one or more of these elements are missing. Let's take a look at each element. Our agricultural products that are combustible at Stewart's Draft include cornstarch, dry milk, sugar, cocoa powder, flour, and powdered milk. These items are considered combustible enough that if the remaining 4 elements exist, then we have the potential for a combustible dust explosion. Like fire, oxygen is needed to support an explosion. About 21% of it exists naturally in the atmosphere. It's the content you and I breathe on a daily basis, and this can be enough content to support combustion. However, other oxygen-generating processes such as oxidizers can support higher levels of combustion. In general, dusts need to be dispersed and suspended in the atmosphere, and it doesn't take much to create a hazard. Dust accumulations on surfaces are not inherently hazards if they just sit there, but if disrupted or allowed to go airborne, should be a cause for significant concern because now it's dispersed into the atmosphere. A volume of combustible dust is typically ignitable when light is nearly totally obscured at a distance of 9 feet away. At this concentration, when dust is suspended and a detonation occurs, it is likely to cause an even greater concern as it will dislodge subtle dust into the atmosphere, providing even more fuel for the explosion. Remember that dispersion occurs when combustible dusts are suspended in the air in a big enough concentration that they're prepared to burn. That is to say, it needs to be suspended in the atmosphere in sufficient quantities to support combustion. Combustible dust explosions occurring in a wide open field is not a very likely scenario, but it does demonstrate the importance of element number 4, confinement. Confinement of combustible dust needs to occur to support detonation of combustible dust. Buildings, process equipment, ducting, and dust collecting equipment are great examples of confinement. Nothing happens without a spark or enough heat to begin the chain reaction necessary to cause a detonation and explosion. Sources of ignition include electrical equipment, static electricity, lighting, or mechanical sources like open flames, heated sources, sparks, friction, or tools. With combustible dust present, with sufficient oxygen, dispersed in the atmosphere of a confined area with an ignition source, then all 5 elements now exist to cause a detonation and explosion of combustible dust. From small detonations come very large events. What can we do to prevent combustible dust explosions in our workplaces? There are some very simple, easy, and effective methods. It's not rocket science. First, inspect and control your work area for combustible dust. Maintain it in such a way that you won't generate combustible dust in your work area to begin with. To achieve this, practice good housekeeping. Remember, a combustible dust explosion may only need a spark to set in motion the explosion, so select the proper tools. A regular shop vac, for instance, is not a safe choice because it can generate a spark while running. Use only dust collection or vacuum systems rated explosion proof. While maintaining equipment and good housekeeping is essential, it's critical that we prevent combustible dust from accumulating due to leaks, poor connections, or open processes that generate dusts. If we can prevent the accumulation, it stands to reason that we've eliminated a major ingredient that causes explosions. It's time to recap what we've learned today. Stewart's Draft has combustible dust in the factory. Parts of a dust explosion include combustible dust, oxygen, confinement of the dust, dispersion of the dust, and an ignition source. What is your role? Remember, inspect your equipment for the presence of combustible dusts and control their accumulation. Perform good housekeeping with the right tools and the right equipment. And lastly, if you can eliminate the source of dust, then it eliminates the hazard in your work area. Congratulations! You've completed the monthly awareness training in combustible dust. To receive credit for this training, make sure that you complete your knowledge check, successfully answer the questions. Thanks for attending. See you next month.